Veyrath Station had never appeared on any tourist map, which was either because no one had thought to make one, or because anyone who'd spent more than 48 hours there would have filed a strongly worded objection to the word tourist. It existed in the neutral corridor between three solar systems, the way a splinter exists between two fingers, technically avoidable, consistently ignored until it became suddenly, urgently impossible to ignore. Its official designation in the Interstellar Humanitarian Coordination Registry was Provisional Humanitarian Transit Point Veyrath 7, status pending review, and it had held that provisional status for 19 years without anyone scheduling the review, which Elias Ward had always privately found to be the most honest thing about the place. Everything here was provisional. The coffee was provisional. The structural integrity reports were, if you read them carefully, somewhat provisional. The air carried the recycled, faintly metallic quality of oxygen that had passed through too many lungs and too much machinery, and was doing its best under the circumstances, which was something Elias could respect. He was 47 years old, and had been doing relief work since an age when most of his university friends were assembling furniture for their first apartments. He was not especially tall, not especially remarkable to look at, possessed of a face that people routinely forgot and then remembered later with mild surprise, and he carried a titanium canteen that had survived things the manufacturer had explicitly noted it was not designed to survive. He had been at Veyrath Station for 6 days. His go bag was already repacked. This was not pessimism. This was professional calibration. The intake corridor on the station's third level processed arriving refugees in a system that had been designed for efficiency and achieved something closer to organized confusion, which was, in Elias' experience, the realistic upper limit of what you could expect when 12 species with incompatible notions of queuing were all trying to occupy the same hallway simultaneously. He stood at Station 7 with his translator tablet and his thermos and the expression he had spent years developing, calm without being vacant, attentive without being alarming, and worked through the line with the steady rhythm of someone who understood that the most useful thing he could do in a crisis was not to look like he was in one. The latest arrivals had come from the Veyrath cluster. Infrastructure collapse. The official reports were calling it a systemic failure. The people who'd lived through it were calling it something that the translator tablet rendered with 3 asterisks and a notation that read idiomatic expression, culturally specific, approximate human equivalent provided upon request. He was midway through scanning the documentation of a Kalahari man whose translator kept rendering his name as either Profound Stillness of Deep Water or Gerald, depending on which dialect setting was active, when he became aware that the line had stopped moving. Not slowed, stopped. The particular quality of stillness that spreads through a crowd when something unexpected has happened near the front, the instinctive, cross-species attentiveness of beings who have learned that sudden stillness in a public space usually means something worth knowing about. He looked up. She was standing approximately 4 meters away, in the middle of the corridor, and she had stopped the way something stops when it encounters something it was not prepared for, completely, suddenly, with the physical grammar of a person whose momentum has been interrupted not by an obstacle but by a recognition. She was tall, close to his height, with dark hair and skin that held a faint iridescence shifting at the edges of perception, the kind of thing you noticed and then weren't quite sure you'd noticed. Her eyes, when they found his, were a deep amber threaded through with something darker, and they were, very specifically and very entirely, looking at him. Not at the general area, not at the station behind him. At him, with the focused, slightly stricken quality of someone who has just seen something they had stopped believing they would ever see. She had 4 fingers on each hand. He noticed this a half second after he noticed that her face had done something sudden and complicated, the kind of expression that arrives before a person has had time to decide whether to have it. He held out the translator tablet with the practiced calm of a man who had learned that the most important thing when something fragile was happening was to move slowly. "Can I help you?" he said in 3 languages sequentially because that was protocol. She looked at the tablet. She looked at him. Then, in the middle of the intake corridor of Veyrath Station, with a 3-hour queue behind her and the recycled air doing its tired best overhead, she began to cry. And something in the back of Elias Ward's mind said, quietly and with considerable certainty, that the rest of his day was no longer going to go according to plan. Preeta took one look at the situation and made the rapid, accurate assessment of someone who had worked crisis intake for 11 years and therefore possessed the particular battlefield intelligence of a person who has seen every variety of human and non-human emotional emergency and learned to triage them by expression alone. She appeared at Elias' elbow with the quiet materialization of a woman who moved efficiently through crowds by never apologizing for existing in them, glanced once at the tall woman with the amber eyes and the tears that were not stopping, glanced once at Elias' face and said, "Go. I have 7, 8, and 9. You owe me lunch." Then she was already turning toward the queue with her own tablet raised, her voice shifting into the warm, carrying tone she used to redirect large numbers of exhausted beings without any of them feeling redirected. Elias guided the woman toward the consultation alcoves off the main corridor, moving slowly, leaving her the space to follow at her own pace rather than feel led. The alcoves were small rooms with a table and 2 chairs, and a window that looked into the station's interior concourse, which meant they offered the illusion of privacy without the claustrophobia of a closed space. A design decision that someone had clearly thought through carefully, and which Elias had been grateful for more times than he could count. He set his thermos on the table. He found 2 cups that were clean by the standard that applied on a provisional humanitarian transit station, which was a standard he had long ago made his peace with. He sat down across from her and waited, because in his experience, the worst thing you could do when someone needed to speak was to fill the silence before they were ready to. She took the translator tablet from him and typed with focused, careful deliberateness, 4-fingered hands steady in the way that hands are steady when steadiness is being actively maintained. The Vethani script on the screen was a series of looping recursive curves that the software processed for several seconds before rendering its result. Her name came first, Sevara. Then, after a pause that seemed intentional, a second line. The full name is Sevara Leon. The second part is a name of honor. I will explain this. He noted it. He waited. She told him about her mother, and she told him slowly, with the careful sequencing of someone who had organized this information many times in her mind and was now navigating the translation delay between her language and his. Her mother's name was Vethana. She had been 26 years old at the time of the Veyrath Station evacuation, 6 months pregnant, on the last shuttle. Elias listened to all of this with the attentive expression he kept professionally available, and inside his mind, he was doing the thing he had learned not to let show on his face, which was conducting a search of a very large and imperfectly organized internal archive. Veyrath Station. He had been to a great many stations. He had worked evacuations on stations whose names he remembered, and stations whose names had been absorbed into the general category of place where something failed at exactly the wrong moment, which was, in the geography of relief work, a heavily populated region. He did not immediately find Veyrath. He found something adjacent to it. He kept his expression attentive and professional and waited to see if more details would help, the way you wait to see if more context will surface the word you know you know. Sevara explained the cascade failure in the transport grid. She explained Bay 7. She explained the relay system and the manual override, and the launch window of 70 seconds, and the 1,200 people on a shuttle that could not launch without a pressure seal, that could not hold without life support, that could not run without someone going into a venting section, to reach a panel that the automated systems could not reach. She explained all of this with the slightly formal precision of someone reciting a history that had been told to them so many times it had taken on the quality of record. And Elias listened. And somewhere around the moment, she said manual override and venting section in the same sentence. The filing cabinet in the back of his mind produced a folder, reluctantly and slightly out of order. And he recognized the shape of what she was describing. He remembered the smell first. Something industrial and chemical, and underneath it, the particular sharpness of atmosphere processing under strain. He remembered the relay panel, which had been older than it should have been, and had required him to bypass 2 safety locks with a tool he had technically not been certified to use at that point in his career, and about which he had chosen to be diplomatically vague in the incident report. He remembered the harmonic resonance in the walls, the low-frequency warning that the structure was making calculations about its own future that were not going well. He remembered running, which he had done with the focused urgency of a man who had just finished a task and would very much like to be elsewhere before the environment formed a strong opinion about his continued presence. What he did not remember, and what he was beginning to understand, mattered very much in a way he had not anticipated when he arrived at Station 7 this morning with his thermos and his translator tablet, and his plan to process intake documentation until dinner, was Vethana's face. He did not remember the shuttle. He had not watched it leave. He had been occupied, at the relevant moment, with a maintenance corridor and a sealed compartment, and the emergency oxygen supply that had lasted just long enough for the secondary response team's sensors to locate him 3 hours later, which was something he had written up in an incident report, and then, in the way of someone who has survived something and has the next deployment already scheduled, more or less moved past. It had not occurred to him that someone was on the other side of that movement, that the shuttle had carried people who had faces and memories, and the capacity to spend 30 years turning a 70-second decision into something they could not put down. He turned his cup in his hands. He looked at Sevara, who had stopped crying in the acute way and was now in the quieter aftermath of it, the iridescence at her temples doing something subtle that he couldn't read yet but was beginning to understand was not nothing. She was watching him with the patient, assessing quality of someone who had expected him not to remember and had prepared herself for that, which somehow made it worse. She spent 30 years, he said, not a question. She built a file, Sevara said, and the translator rendered it plainly without emphasis, which made it land with more weight than emphasis would have. Physical and digital. She submitted your biometric profile to the Veyrath Resettlement Coordination System 11 years ago, when the cross-species survivor tracing protocols became available. The system flagged your registration here 6 days ago. She paused. I am the qualified humanitarian liaison assigned to assess flags of this kind at Veyrath Station. I opened your file this morning. Elias absorbed this. Outside the alcove window, the station's concourse moved with its usual density. A supply cart navigating around a cluster of Kalahari children. 2 responders in yellow vests conducting an argument that had clearly been running for several shifts. The ordinary managed chaos of a place that processed grief in bulk and tried to do it with dignity. He had registered at this station 6 days ago. For 11 years before that, somewhere in the infrastructure of interstellar humanitarian coordination, a system had been quietly looking for his face. She doesn't know yet, he said. Your mother? No, but she's alive. Yes, Sevara said. And then something shifted in her expression, something that the translator flagged a moment later with a small notation. Veyrath dry register, humor, approximate equivalent. Understatement deployed in emotionally loaded context. She is going to have a great deal to say about the fact that the system found you at a refugee intake station. She has opinions about the inadequacy of cross-species survivor tracing infrastructure. She has, in fact, published several of them. Elias looked at the notation on the tablet. He looked at Sevara. Then for the first time since the corridor he almost smiled. "She sounds," he said carefully, "like someone who finishes things." Savara looked at him with her amber-threaded eyes, and the iridescence at her wrists shifted toward something warmer. "She named me for you," she said. "Before she knew your name, when she found it, she considered changing mine. She decided not to." She set the translator tablet gently on the table between them. "I think you should call her." The station's long-range communications terminal was located on the 4th level, in a room that the official station directory listed under Administrative Infrastructure, and which Elias located by following a hand-lettered sign that read COMMS in 3 languages and an arrow that pointed, with some confidence, in 2 different directions simultaneously. The room smelled of old wiring and the particular institutional staleness of equipment that had been doing its job reliably for so long that no one had thought to replace it, which in Elias' experience described either very good engineering or a maintenance budget that had been quietly redirected to something more urgent and never redirected back. Both were common in provisional humanitarian transit stations. Both were, in their own way, a kind of faith. Prita was already there when they arrived, which should not have surprised him and did not quite. She was standing at the main terminal with the expression of a person who has decided that a thing needs doing and has taken a personal interest in doing it correctly, and will not be discussing the authorization question at this time. She had commandeered the humanitarian priority channel, which technically required a level 4 clearance and a documented emergency, and which she was apparently prepared to argue, if pressed, constituted both. She had also, through means Elias did not ask about, and which she did not offer to explain, already pulled the contact coordinates from Savara's file and loaded them into the routing system. 14-minute signal delay each way on standard relay, she said, without looking up from the console. "I've requested a priority bounce through the Cathara junction, which brings it down to about 4 minutes. The junction is going to log the request and someone is going to ask me about it on Thursday, and I will handle Thursday on Thursday." She looked up. "Do you want coffee?" "I have coffee," Elias said, holding up his thermos. "That's not coffee, that's a psychological coping mechanism in liquid form," Prita said, and turned back to the console. "I'm making real coffee. The good kind. The kind I keep in my locker and don't share with people who don't deserve it. You currently deserve it." Savara was watching this exchange with the careful attention of someone calibrating the social dynamics of a new environment, and Elias noticed that the iridescence at her temples had shifted to the cooler register. He was beginning to associate with concentration. He had worked alongside enough non-human colleagues over the years to have developed a functional sensitivity to the ways that bodies communicated what language hadn't yet caught up to. And Savara's iridescence, he was increasingly certain, was doing a great deal of communicating. Right now, it suggested something between apprehension and the specific alertness of a person who is present at an important moment and is aware of being present at it. He sat down in the chair in front of the terminal and looked at the screen, which displayed the contact coordinates Prita had loaded and a connection status that currently read routing in the patient, blinking way of systems that were doing their best across a significant amount of physics. Somewhere on the other side of that routing, across relay stations and signal bounces, and whatever the Cathara junction was going to log and Prita was going to handle on Thursday, there was a woman who was 61 years old and had a file with his name on it, and had not yet been told that the file had found something. He thought about what to say. He had been thinking about it since the alcove in the background, running underneath the conversation and the walk through the station's corridors, and the moment when Savara had paused at the entrance to the comms room and looked at him with the expression of someone handing something heavy to someone else and trusting them not to drop it. He had constructed several openings and discarded all of them. He had considered the approach he used in reunification scenarios, which was gentle and structured, and began with establishing that everyone was physically safe before proceeding to anything else. He had considered a simple identification, which felt correct in outline and insufficient in texture. He had considered beginning with an apology, which felt wrong in a way he could articulate if pressed. He had not done anything wrong exactly. He had simply not known. Not knowing and doing nothing were different things. He had learned that distinction early in his career, and it remained one of the few certainties he carried. The connection status changed. Routing became establishing, and then, after a pause long enough to be felt, connected. The screen resolved in stages. First, a smear of blue light that might have been a garment or a room or an artifact of the relay system having a feeling about the whole thing. Then something that was almost a face. Then, with the slight lurch of a signal finding its final resolution, completely and entirely a face. And the face was looking at the screen with the wariness of someone who had answered an unknown call from an unknown origin address, with the automatic caution of a person who had spent decades being cautiously hopeful and had learned to lead with caution. Veyrath was 61 years old and looked like her daughter the way a source looks like something that has traveled from it, recognizably related, differently shaped by the distance. The iridescence was more pronounced in her, a fuller expression of what Sevara carried in quieter form, and it was currently doing something rapid and complex that moved through several registers in the space of 2 seconds when she saw his face. He watched it happen. He watched the wariness encounter something it had not been built to process and try to reorganize itself around it. He said the thing he had arrived at, which was not perfectly constructed and was not an incident report, and had no particular precedent in his professional experience. "I'm sorry it took this long to find each other." What Veyrath did was not quite crying, and not quite not crying. It was the moment before, the suspended instant when the body has received the information and is deciding what to do with it. And she stayed in that instant for long enough that Elias became aware of Sevara, very quietly moving to stand at the edge of the room, where she could see the screen without being in the center of it, occupying as little space as a tall woman could reasonably occupy, which was still a considerable amount of space, but was offered with such evident care that it felt like none at all. Veyrath said, in human standard that carried the careful architecture of a language maintained through deliberate practice over a long time, "You are alive." "I am," he said. "I'm sorry I didn't know you were looking." There was a pause that might have been the signal delay or might have been her needing a moment, and then she said, "I did not know your name for 7 years. I knew your face and a sound that might have been the beginning of a name. I used to think, perhaps I made you simpler than you were. A reason, something to hold the shape of what happened." She stopped, pressed the back of her hand to her mouth for a moment in a gesture that was almost human, except that the iridescence at her wrist was doing something very bright and very fast. "I published 3 papers on the failures of cross-species survivor tracing. 2 of them were specifically about cases where individuals who performed critical interventions during mass evacuations were lost to record because reporting systems were not designed to track them across deployments." Elias absorbed this. Were any of them cited by the team that designed the biometric flagging protocol? Veyrath looked at him. "Both of the relevant ones," she said, and the iridescence shifted into a register he couldn't name but which felt, in the way that some things feel even across a screen and a signal bounce and 30 years, like something between grief and satisfaction, and the particular exhaustion of a person who has pushed a thing uphill for a long time and has just now, finally, watched it crest. Behind him, very quietly, Preeta set a cup of real coffee on the console beside his elbow and retreated to the far side of the room with the tact of someone who had decided that the best thing she could do right now was to become temporarily invisible, which she achieved with impressive professionalism for a person who was definitely still listening. Veyrath asked him what had happened on the station, and he told her the way he wrote incident reports, sequentially, plainly, without the narrative architecture that the story had apparently acquired in the 30 years since. The relay panel. The safety bypass. The manual override, which had taken 40 seconds longer than it should have because the panel's tertiary control had been installed by someone who either had a very individual philosophy about standardized fittings or had been working from the wrong schematic. And Elias had spent a portion of those 40 seconds conducting a brief, focused, entirely internal debate about the life choices that had brought him to this specific panel at this specific moment, which was not a debate he had ever mentioned in any incident report, and which he mentioned now because it seemed, after 30 years, like the details were owed to someone. The structural resonance, the running, the maintenance corridor that had held when the section didn't, which he had always attributed to the specific stubbornness of older construction, the kind of infrastructure that had been built before the cost-efficiency models, and which simply declined to fail on the same schedule as everything around it. 3 hours in a sealed compartment with emergency oxygen and a broken wrist from a fall, he had not mentioned in the incident report, because the incident report had felt long enough and the wrist had healed. The secondary response team's sensors finding him, the deployment after that, the one after that. He watched Veyrath's face while he spoke. The iridescence moved through registers he was learning to read the way you learn the weather patterns of a place you have just arrived, imperfectly, intuitively, with the awareness that you are probably missing things but also probably getting some things right. When he mentioned the broken wrist, she made a small sound that the translator in his earpiece rendered, after a brief pause, as contextually equivalent to, "Of course there was." He found that he didn't mind. "The system that found you," Veyrath said, when he finished. "The biometric flagging protocol. It was not designed to track individuals across relief deployments originally. That function was added in the second revision." She said this with the measured delivery of a person reporting a fact that they are aware is also, quietly, about themselves. "The second revision incorporated recommendations from a paper I wrote in the 14th year after Veyrath. I argued that humanitarian responders who moved between crisis sites were systematically invisible to survivor tracing infrastructure because the systems were built to track displaced civilians, not the people who moved between them. I did not know when I wrote it that I was writing about a specific person. I thought I was writing about a category." Elias turned this over. He looked at the screen. He thought about a woman spending 14 years building, from grief and professional discipline, and the particular stubbornness of someone who refuses to accept that a thing cannot be done, the infrastructure that had eventually found him. He thought about the incident report he had filed, which had been thorough and accurate and had not, in any way he'd been aware of at the time, been addressed to anyone in particular. "You built the thing that found me," he said. "I built the argument," she said. "Other people built the thing. I just made it difficult for them to justify not building it." The iridescence at her temples did something that Sevara, from the corner of the room, appeared to recognize, because she made a sound that the translator flagged as Veyrathani vocalization, affectionate exasperation, familial register. Veyrath glanced toward the edge of the frame where she could have. Elias sat with all of this for a moment. Outside the comms room, the station continued its patient, provisional business. The intake queues, the supply manifests, the recycled air making its rounds through corridors that had processed more grief than any building ought to hold and had held it anyway, which was also a kind of stubbornness, and which he had always, somewhere underneath the professionalism, found quietly extraordinary. He had spent 22 years moving through places like this one. He had understood himself, in the way that people understand themselves when they have not stopped moving long enough to look carefully, as someone defined by motion. The next deployment, the next station, the go bag always repacked. He thought about the canteen in his pack, the one sentimental object, the one thing he had carried from the beginning. He had never, when he examined it honestly, been sure why he'd kept it. Sentiment was not an explanation he'd found fully satisfying. It was old and battered, and the manufacturer had a reasonable case that its continued existence was a personal affront. But he had kept it, and he had carried it. And it occurred to him now, in the way that things occur to you when you have finally sat still long enough, that maybe it had been the one thing he had allowed himself to carry that was not about the next crisis. That was just about having been somewhere and survived it and taken something small away. "I would like to meet you," Veyrath said, not with urgency, with the quietness of someone who has waited long enough that they have made peace with waiting and no longer need to perform impatience. "When it is possible, when you have finished what you're doing there," Preeta, from the far side of the room, said, with the careful neutrality of someone who had definitely been listening. "His current deployment ends in 3 weeks. Elias turned and looked at her. "Administratively speaking," Preeta said, studying the middle distance. He looked back at the screen. Veyrath was watching him with the amber-threaded eyes that her daughter had, and the iridescence that her daughter carried in quieter form, and the expression of someone who has arrived at the last page of something very long and is allowing themselves, carefully, to believe it. 3 weeks, he said. He reached into his pack and took out the canteen. He set it on the console beside Preeta's real coffee. He was not entirely sure why, except that it felt, in the way of gestures that don't require full explanation, like the right thing to do with something he had been carrying long enough. Like setting it